Let's look at the very first fact that I can think of. And that is the original starting point of the United States Navy. Now, one thing about this is the original date, the starting point, and even location is somewhat debated. Pretty much, you have two cities that have been arguing back and forth for decades about which city founded the US Navy. However, most historians pretty much acknowledge the fact that Marblehead was the original founding location. This is because Marblehead was home to the first ever armed schooner, and that was the USS Hannah. This particular craft was armed with four 4-pounder guns and was aimed to thwart off British ships. Originally commissioned by George Washington, it was acquired on August 24th, 1775. Now, one thing that historians do know, and this is where you kind of get into the debate, is the Hannah was transferred to Beverly, and that's why Beverly's like, no, we are the ones that created the Navy. However, unfortunately, this ship did not have a long life because she eventually ran aground on October 10th of that year. And another unfortunate fact is there's not a lot of information of what happened to this ship afterwards, whether or not it was scrapped or destroyed. They don't really know. One thing that they do know is shortly after that, on October 13th, the government had ordered 2 new ships with guns, creating the Navy for the United States of America. Now, the question I want to throw to you is, do you know how the Navy gets its names for its ships? Now, I know it's not really something that we think about all the time, but when that question comes up, you kind of go, well, how does that happen? Basically, in history, you had battleships that were named after the states, you had cruisers that are named after the cities, and destroyers that are named after famous American naval leaders or leaders in general. And as a matter of fact, that system for the destroyers is still honored today. However, submarines, though, they are a little bit different because for them, they've been named after cities and states and all that sort of stuff. And on top of that, you have aircraft carriers, which are generally named after presidents. And for some of these that are named after individuals, such as the destroyers, one thing that's really kind of a tradition is that the oldest living female relative of that person that they are naming the ship after has to christen the ship. It's really kind of an old tradition that they still do today. Speaking about submarines, let's mention the fact that all submarines and submarine service is completely volunteer. That's right, the United States Navy does not force any individual to go into submarine service. And of course, if one was to sign up, they really do look into this and they go through a lot of tests to see if you are to fit the bill. And also in history, women were never part of the submarine service because they were like, well, there's no privacy, that sort of thing. But however, much has changed because women do actually serve as submariners, and the first female submariner was Britta W. Christensen. She became the first dive officer of the watch, and she held the rank of supply officer lieutenant. Also, for submarines, their job is really quite demanding that you actually get 4 meals a day. That's pretty nice. I also want to just mention the fact that was kind of like 3 facts in 1 fact. That's why we call it 10 plus facts. And speaking about facts, by the way, I did mention it earlier, but this is a part of our US military playlist, which I've done a few videos. I've talked about the Navy SEALs, and I'm doing other, topics in the future. And I'm just going to put a card in this video for you guys to check out. It's also going to be in the description box below. All right, so here's the next really interesting fact. Remember how I said that the Navy started back in like 1775? Well, here's an interesting fact. The Navy was not continuous from that starting point. As a matter of fact, it stopped at some point in history. This happened in 1785 after the American Revolutionary War, where the entire Navy was disbanded. Partially because the US had sold all their ships, they didn't think that they really needed them, and on top of that, they didn't really have the budget for it either. But however, by 1794, things had gotten out of hand with the piracy in the Barbary states, which are in Africa. To deal with this, America had to build themselves a new fleet, and thus they created the Naval Act of 1794, thus giving us the second day of the Navy's creation. And you may think to yourself, 1794, yeah, that's cool, they got their own admirals. Well, actually, believe it or not, they didn't have an official admiral until much later. The first admiral for the Navy wasn't until July 16th of 1882. This was known as David Glasgow Farragut, in which he was granted Rear Admiral on that particular day. Before that, if you had a high rank in the Navy, you were considered what is known as a flag officer. However, that was kind of a temporary sort of rank until they decided what official ranks they wanted to adopt. Now, I mentioned this before. I was talking about aircraft carriers, and for me, I think aircraft carriers are some of the coolest pieces of hardware that the US Navy has. As a matter of fact, one of the coolest things was when I was working on a cruise ship, I actually managed to see an aircraft carrier way off into the distance. And the reason I knew it was an aircraft carrier is because its hangar doors were open, and I was like, can see right through it. That's an aircraft carrier. That, and the guy that was also part of the Navy that was on board was like, yep, there's one right there. Rare to see, but there it is. And of course, for some people who aren't too familiar with the US Navy, they may think, oh yeah, aircraft carriers came around in the Second World War. That wasn't the case. They were actually around prior to that. The first aircraft carrier for the country was the USS Langley. It was also the US's first turbo-electric powered ship that was converted from a bulk collier ship named the USS Jupiter. The USS Jupiter was built in 1912, and the refit into an aircraft carrier for the USS Langley was commissioned on March 20th, 1920. Side note, and this also moves on to my next fact, but this is still about aircraft carriers. Did you know that James T. Kirk from the show Star Trek was originally going to command the USS Yorktown? Instead of it being the USS Enterprise, which we all now commonly know, the USS Yorktown was going to be named after the great aircraft carrier from the Second World War that went down after being struck by a Japanese sub on June 6, 1942. However, this was changed to the USS Enterprise in kind of honor to the new USS Enterprise aircraft carrier. This aircraft carrier was the world's first nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, which started construction in 1957 and was launched on September 24th, 1960. So Gene Roddenberry kind of just said, you know what, with this new ship out there, we just kind of want to, be honorable. We're going to rename the Yorktown to the USS Enterprise. Also, the nuclear-powered aircraft carrier was named after the Second World War USS Enterprise, which was also an aircraft carrier. Kind of confusing. It was known as the Big E. You've probably heard that before. And it was one of only 3 aircraft carriers that survived the Second World War that was built before the war started. Speaking about ships and large ones, let's talk about submarines. The biggest one of these that the USA has ever made was the Ohio-class submarine. Although it is the 3rd biggest submarine in the world, coming in at a total length of 170 meters or 560 feet, currently, it is under the Typhoon or Aquila class submarine, which actually I did a video about that. I'll also put that in the description box below for you guys to check out. Really cool submarine. I mean, it was armed to the teeth with nukes. It was insane. However, unlike the Russian Typhoon Aquila class, the United States had more of these Ohio class submarines, and all of them are actually still in use today. Originally, they had plans to build 24 of them, but they only had 18 built. And in today's world, they are capable of firing 24 Trident 1C4 missiles, in which each one is loaded with 8 100-kiloton warheads. Just imagine what it would be like if all 18 of those babies fired at once. No wonder why the Cold War was very, very serious. All right, let's jump back to big things that are on the surface, and that is battleships. I love them. Now, similar to aircraft carriers, they have also been around for quite a long time. As a matter of fact, the first one was the USS Texas. She was launched on June 28, 1892, and we all know Texas is big because if that name didn't foreshadow the future of the battleships, then I don't know what would. Because let's be real, World War II was where you saw the biggest, the most powerful battleships in the entire world, and we will probably never ever see anything like that ever again. One of the largest of these with the most amount of firepower was the USS Iowa, which also spawned the Iowa-class battleships, in which they had 6 of them. Most of these battleships obviously served in the Pacific to bombard little islands that the Japanese had occupied. But as for the USS Iowa, it was the only Iowa-class battleship to serve in the Atlantic Ocean. The USS Iowa is now a museum, and during the height of the Second World War, they had approximately 2,700 sailors on board this type of battleship. And for their size, when I meant they were big, they were huge. Coming in at a length of 860 feet long with a width beam of 108 feet. Of course, for my American friends out there, this is a length of 262.13 meters and a width or beam of 32.97 meters. Also, and kind of last, kind of the fact there is a bit of a debate that most people might not be up to date with, and that is whether or not the USA still has battleships in its Navy. Well, for a long time, I actually thought that this was true. I heard that they had 4 of these in reserve, but as of 2014, not anymore. But however, it's interesting to know that the United States was the last country to have these battleships in reserve until their names were struck from the Naval Registry. Nowadays, though, most of these battleships have been turned or transferred into museums, but did you know that the United States is the only North American country to have battleships as museums? As a matter of fact, they're one of 3 countries in the entire world to have battleships as a viewing thing for the public. Japan has the Mikasa, and there is one in China, but it is classified as a replica.
Now, back in 2000, Donald Trump actually made a bid to run for president. He made a bid for the presidency as a part of the Reform Party, and he even got the support from Jesse Ventura, who wanted to become vice president. Trump obviously ended up dropping out of the race, but he did manage to win the California and the Michigan primaries. Now, this video will be posted before the US 2016 presidential election. So if you are out there and do not want Donald Trump to win, hit that like button. Alright, so enough goofing off, let's get serious now. More people have been diagnosed with mental disorders than any other nation on earth.
Beer make Homer something something.
Go crazy?
Don't mind if I do!
There are 3 towns in the United States that have the name Santa Claus. Now, did you know that the state of Alaska has a longer coastline than all the 49 other states combined? The current US flag that you see right here was designed by a 17-year-old student. It was all done for a school project, and he ended up getting a B- for it. Now let's journey back to 1793. That was the year when the shortest inaugural speech by a president was given. This speech, done by George Washington, was only 135 words long, and it was that short because his dentures hurt in his mouth. Now for the longest presidential speech, this was done by William Henry Harrison in 1841. And he gave this speech in the snow without a hat or without a jacket, and unfortunately he ended up dying within a month from pneumonia. So now all the Americans out there are going to need some laser sharp vision for this one. Did you know that all of the 50 states are listed at the top of the Lincoln Memorial on the back of the $5 bill? Yeah, you can check it out, like if you want to just double check, make sure that these facts are correct. I did it, and yeah, they're there. Now, did you know that in the United States, smoking is attributed to a death every 5 minutes? So before this video is over, somebody's gonna die from smoking related illnesses. Now, this one actually blew my mind. Did you know that the United States doesn't actually have an official language? Yeah, up here in Canada, we have English and French as our official languages. I assume that in America it was English and Spanish. And no, actually, there's no official language. English, specifically American English, is the most commonly spoken language in the US. As well as American English is used for legislation, regulations, executive orders, treaties, federal court rulings, and all other official documents, although it's not the official language. They should change that though. At the time of filming this, in 31 states, the rapist can actually sue for child custody rights if they raped a woman and she got pregnant from it. That's also gotta change, really. Now, just to give you an idea of how much of an abundance of resources that Americans have at their disposal, one American consumes as much resources as 32 people in Kenya. Yeah, America is a land overflowing with resources and opportunity. I have no idea why there's so many people below the poverty line. Injustice here, man. Okay, now this is gonna sound very backwards because of America's history and slavery, but did you know that there was a man by the name of Anthony Johnson? Now, he was the first legal slave owner in America. He was a black man and owned 2 white slaves. Anthony Johnson lived from 1600 to 1670. Now, some of you US history buffs may know this one. The United States actually purchased Alaska from Russia for only $7.2 million in 1867. I'm glad America has control over Alaska, just in case like the Russians try to attack Canada. At least we have America in the middle to protect us. Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. Now, in America, it's completely legal for a minor to smoke cigarettes. However, what they can't do is buy the cigarettes. Now, at the rate things are going, there would need to be 4 planet Earths in order to sustain the level of consumption in the US. So not only does the United States have an abundance in resources, but people are just very wasteful with the resources. Now this next one is not exactly a USA fact, but it's actually an American fact. And before you guys say that, hey, it's the same thing, no. Actually, there's North America and South America. So Canada, USA, and all the other countries in South America can be called America as well. Just putting it out there. The Africanized bee, also known as the killer bee. Ouch, man! Did you just sting me when I'm filming? I'm gonna see you after this video. But do you know that these Africanized bee, or these killer bees, like the one that tried to kill me now, they're actually a hybrid, and they actually escaped a lab quarantine, and ever since then have been spreading all over the Americas. Now the state with the most millionaires per capita is Maryland. Not New York, not California, Maryland. Now 86% of American men had listed having children in their definition of finding success. However, for women, that number was just 73%. Now maybe it's because the women are the ones that have to push out the baby. Now the poverty rate for households that are led by married couples is 6.8%. And for those households that are led by a female single parent, the poverty rate is 37.1%. That's got to tell you something about having a family structure in society. So those are 20 weird facts about the United States that I'm sure you guys did not know. Okay, maybe you guys knew a couple of them, but yeah. Now there are so much things about the United States that I can't even wrap up this video without giving you a bonus fact. Minoy, Nebraska only has one resident, and she's the mayor, the librarian, and the bartender. As well as there's one town in Colorado, they literally celebrate a frozen dead guy. So Frozen Dead Guys Day is an annual celebration held in the town of Nederland, Colorado. They celebrate the 1994 discovery of the cryonic state corpse of Brado Morstol. Okay, so getting into this, people believe America just won't mind its own business. Yeah, America has toppled many publicly supported democratic governments around the world. After World War II, the CIA committed horrible acts and replaced democracies with dictatorships in countries all around the world for more than 30 years. The justification was often that the Soviets had influence over those countries, but in many cases there was little or no evidence to back up these claims. Countries that have suffered at the hands of the United States government are Afghanistan, Angola, Australia, Bolivia, Brazil, Cambodia, Chile, Congo, Cuba, Dominican Republic, Ecuador, El Salvador, Greece, Guatemala, Haiti, Honduras, Hungary, Indonesia, Iran, Iraq, Italy, Laos, Nicaragua, Panama, Uruguay, and Vietnam. And these are only some of the countries that have substantial amount of information available to the public. Adding to that now, after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, the West, including US, Britain, and France, carved up the Middle East based on their own ideas, so that also had its own set of problems. Now, I just listed off a ton of countries that have huge issues with America, but what countries dislike America the most? Let me get into that. It's not just America's enemies who don't like America, it's people in countries that are supposed to be America's friends, if not their allies. Starting off with Iran. Iran has been chanting stuff like death to America since the Iranian Revolution in 1979. In 1979, Iranian revolutionaries seized the US embassy in Tehran, taking 66 Americans hostage for 440 days. There have been US restrictions on activities with Iran in one form or the other since then. More recently, the US and the other Western nations have imposed extremely severe sanctions on Iran in an attempt to curb its nuclear capabilities. Continuing now with Jordan, anti-Americanism is felt strongly in Jordan, despite the country being a close American ally. Apparently, anti-Americanism rose drastically in Jordan after the 2003 invasion of Iraq by US troops to remove Saddam Hussein from power. Although negative attitudes in the last couple years have gone down quite a bit, anti-Americanism is still amongst the most widespread in Jordan than any other country in the world. The next country is Pakistan. So negative attitudes towards the US's influence on the world has risen in Pakistan as a result of US drone attacks on the country introduced by George W. Bush and continued by Barack Obama. Of course, gotta include Russia. Russia has a long history of anti-Americanism dating back to the early days of the Cold War. In some of the latest Russian population polls, the United States and its allies constantly top the list of the greatest threats. The Ukrainian crisis aggravated matters, and a large number of Russians hold unfavorable views towards the Americans because of the sanctions imposed against Russia by the US and its allies as a result of the crisis. In fact, very recently, Vladimir Putin asked over 900 US diplomats to leave Russia immediately as a result of US's sanctions on Russia. And we have China. In China, there has been a history of anti-Americanism, beginning with the general disdain for foreigners in the early 19th century that culminated in the Boxer Revolution in 1900. When Mao Zedong and the communists came to power in 1948, he launched an anti-American campaign that intensified as China and US fought a major undeclared war in Korea in 1950 to 1953. So to wrap up this video, in some countries there's even a belief that if enough nations oppose the United States of America, the American people will finally wake up and realize what's going on around the world. However, this approach doesn't seem to be working, as hundreds of thousands of people every single year continue to flock to America, and America is seen by many as a land of opportunity and definitely a place where you can find success. So with continual fighting amongst the nations where each side is trying to be right and label the other wrong, issues just continue to perpetuate.